And so, in that spirit, I have two very good friends that are about to speak on the panel, Jerry Taylor and Ben Zycher. And Jerry and Ben disagree about the pluses and the minuses about the senator's proposal and about a carbon tax. But they do so collegially, and they're good friends too. And I think that that's the atmosphere that we want to produce here at AI and defend to the death. Now we're going to listen to Ben Zycher talk about all the things that he thinks are wrong about this proposal. Ben's going to go for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then Jerry's going to perhaps agree with some of those points and perhaps disagree for about 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to cross-examine them for a few minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions. We're scheduled to end at 4:15. And if we're running late, then I might let us run late if there are still a lot of questions. And so the 4:15, I'm not going to impose a vicious hard stop there. And so with that, I now hand it over to my friend and colleague, Ben Zycher. Ben?
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. I really appreciate your time today. I really could speak at great length about the Schatz or Whitehouse Schatz proposal, particularly in light of the comments they made today. Given the time limitations, I'm going to limit myself to just a few central points. First, some comments on the $45 per ton tax and the administration's calculation of the social cost of carbon. I want to talk briefly about two parameters that the senators never talk about: what the temperature effect of their tax would be in 2100, even if applied not only by the U.S. but by much of the industrialized world. And I want to talk about the evidence on whether or not the greenhouse gas externality is important. I want to talk briefly about the wealth redistribution issue and, or as Senator Whitehouse puts it, returning the revenues to the American people. I want to offer a brief comment on the phrase carbon pollution. And then I do have a couple of observations on Senator Whitehouse proposal to subject people who disagree with him to the RICO statutes. So where did this $45 per ton tax come from? Senator Whitehouse claims it's the midpoint of the range of estimates provided by the Interagency Working Group analysis of the social cost of carbon. That's not really quite right if you look at their table, but let's simply accept that. The question is, how reliable is that analysis? In fact, if you look at the Interagency Working Group analysis of the social cost of carbon, it really turns out to be a deeply flawed analytic exercise with four central problems. First, there's the use of global rather than U.S. benefits. They estimate the benefit side of reducing greenhouse gas emissions globally rather than for the U.S. alone, despite the fact that OMB requirements direct them to do the opposite. Now, it's rather curious, frankly, that they did that, given that this is supposed to be a quest for economic efficiency. If you're going to use global benefits, in other words, reduce U.S. emissions and such by a magnitude sufficient to equate the marginal costs and benefits of global emissions of greenhouse gases, that means two things. Not only would the rest of the world have an incentive to free ride on U.S. efforts, it would be efficient for the rest of the world to free ride on U.S. efforts because the U.S. is already optimizing global emissions. And furthermore, that given that the U.S. is not the only emitter, it can't be the case that it's always cheaper for the U.S. to reduce these emissions than other economies. Then there is the conflation of GDP and climate effects. If you look at the three major models, there's Bill Nordhaus' DICE model, Richard Toll's fund model, and Chris Hope's page model. These are models that estimate the interaction of greenhouse gas reductions and GDP effects and all the rest. What you'll find is that in the models, and this is what the Interagency Working Group did, they estimate the GDP effect of an assumed increase in temperatures and other climate effects attendant upon an increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. They then estimate that GDP effect, they divide by emissions, and that's how they come up with the social cost of carbon. So if you have a large GDP and a trivial climate effect, you can still come up with a very large social cost of carbon. In fact, that's what, just to pick one example, Bill Nordhaus' DICE model does. And that's why, just to again pick one example, the Interagency Working Group in their social cost of carbon analysis estimated $31 billion of benefits, of climate benefits in the year 2030 from reducing greenhouse gas concentrations or emissions, even though the temperature effect, not in 2030, but in 2100 is barely measurable. That's a result that is simply not plausible. And the Interagency Working Group in their analysis simply glosses over it. There is the refusal to use a 7% discount rate despite the requirement to do so in OMB Circular A4. And the reason they don't use a 7% discount rate is obvious. It's because once you do that, the social cost of carbon falls close to zero or becomes even negative, depending on which the scenarios you look at. And then finally, and perhaps most important, if you look at the social cost of carbon and the supposed benefits resulting from reducing U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, virtually none of it has anything to do with climate. Almost all of it is particulate reductions, or what they call co-benefits. Okay, I'm sure some of you heard that term. The problem is not only that this is a kind of a dishonest way of promoting a climate policy, but the EPA has now used the very same particulate reductions 4 times to justify, they're quadruple counted for the same 4 reductions in particulate emissions to justify 4 different regulatory initiatives: the Clean Power Plan, the particulate rule, the ozone rule, and the utility mercury rule. So let's talk first about the first thing that the senators don't talk about. What would the temperature effects in the year 2100 be from their proposal? Well, if you use the Obama Climate Action Plan as a proxy for the Whitehouse Schatz proposal, the effect of the Climate Action Plan in the U.S. would be 15 1,000ths of a degree in the year 2100 if you use the EPA climate model, which all of us use who work in this area because you don't have to have a supercomputer to run it. It's one of the models IPIC uses. Everyone uses this model. If you add in the supposed agreement with the Chinese announced last November, that's a bit of a joke, but if you add that in, you get another 1/100th rather of 1 degree. If you throw in a 20%, I think it's a 20%, I can't read this from this distance, but if you throw in a 20% reduction by the Chinese in 2030, you get another 0.2 of a degree. Throw in the rest of the industrialized world, you get another 0.2 of a degree. The total effect of this policy would be something on the order of somewhere between 4 and 1/2 of a degree in the year 2100. If we're going to talk about efficiency, we really ought to talk about benefit cost analysis. How much is that worth? Let's talk about the actual evidence. You've heard a bunch of assertions about rising temperatures and all these adverse effects, droughts and the rest. If we look at the actual evidence in the peer-reviewed literature in government databases, the temperature record actually is ambiguous. Temperatures have been rising in fits and starts since the end of the Little Ice Age, roughly in 1850. The question then becomes how much of that is due to greenhouse gassing, increases in greenhouse gas concentrations. The answer is no one knows. Even IPIC is starting to reduce its estimate of the climate sensitivity of the atmosphere to increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. The correlation of greenhouse gas concentrations and the rate of sea level increase is ambiguous in the peer-reviewed literature. The Arctic and Antarctic ice covers don't differ statistically from the 1981 to 2010 average. The Antarctic ice cover is right at the top of that 2 standard deviation confidence interval. The Arctic ice cover is right near the bottom, but both of them are within that confidence interval. If you look at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration data on tornadoes, what you'll find is that at least since 1970, tornado counts and intensities have been falling more or less monotonically. Tropical cyclone, the frequency and the accumulated energy, in other words, the destructiveness of tropical cyclones, are at their lowest levels since satellite measurements began in the early 1970s. U.S. wildfires are not correlated. If you look at the data from the National Wildfire Reporting Center in Boise, are not correlated with the temperature record. The Palmer Drought Index shows no trend since 1895. U.S. flooding, in a new paper by Heiberg and Ryan, or a couple of guys in one of the hydrological journals, U.S. flooding is not correlated with increased greenhouse gas concentrations over the last century. And if you look at the UN data, per capita food production has increased and undernourishment has decreased, both more or less monotonically, since 1993. The argument that the senators gave us today, that somehow the effects of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations are visible and obvious and are creating adverse effects that are measurable, is not consistent with the data. Is it really an accident that the dominant effect of climate policy is an increase in energy costs in red states relative to blue ones? I think the answer is no, it's not an accident. Or to ask that same question a bit differently, suppose it were the case that were blue states rather than red states that were disproportionately dependent on coal-fired power. Would we be seeing the Clean Power Plan from this administration or this proposal from the senators? That question, I think, answers itself. Then there's the argument that the revenues will be restored to the American people, or returned rather to the American people, which actually means whichever interest groups emerge victorious in this complex congressional bargaining process. You know, some people argue we're going to subsidize the poor over the medium term in order to sort of ease the transition for them. But the problem is the poor, not the median voters. And so it's very difficult for me to believe that you can have a political equilibrium in which it's the poor and corporations who get the benefits of these revenues. Let me turn now to the phrase carbon pollution. That phrase really, to be blunt about it, is political propaganda. You know, carbon dioxide is not carbon, and it's not a pollutant. Some minimum concentration of carbon dioxide is necessary for life. You know, water vapor by far is the most important greenhouse gas in terms of the radiative properties of the atmosphere. I don't hear anybody calling that a pollutant. I really would urge everyone to use the phrase greenhouse gases, which has the virtue of scientific accuracy, without assuming the answer to the underlying policy question. Finally, you know, Senator Whitehouse tried to downplay this a few minutes ago, but he very clearly suggests that the fossil fuel industry, and presumably others as well, be subjected to RICO prosecution, basically for making arguments that are inconsistent with his policy proposals. Has he never heard of the First Amendment? I think he probably has. You know, I remember, I'm old enough, most of you are not, to remember ancient history 10 years ago when dissent was the highest form of patriotism. Remember that? No more. The argument that dissenters should face RICO prosecution or investigations or whatever really is a long step toward a world of totalitarianism, and I urge all of you to reject it. The proposed tax is based upon, in conclusion, a deeply flawed analysis of the social cost of carbon. It would have trivial temperature effects, but a large redistribution of impact. The senators offer no evidence that this externality is serious and needs to be confronted in a costly way, and that Senator Whitehouse now seeks to silence dissent, I think speaks volumes about his view of policy debate. Thank you very much indeed.
The little mic that they bothered to paste to me doesn't seem to be working. So anyway, Jerry, if you want to make your own prepared remarks, and then respond to Ben. Then when I cross-examine the two of you, you'll have ample opportunity to respond to Ben.
Yeah, I think to be fair to Ben, since he's not going to get a set-piece opportunity to respond to me, I won't directly respond to him. We'll leave that to your cross-examination, Kevin, and the Q&A from the audience. But I probably will indirectly address many of the issues Ben discussed, mostly because it's very difficult to have a conversation about policy responses to climate change without agreement that a policy response is warranted in the first place. So while I don't hope to play science guy at the panel, I think we need to have a brief conversation to set the stage. If my slides will show up. There we go. First of all, let's consider whether the pause in climate change or in warming should cause us to rethink policy action. I hear this quite a bit out of my friends on the right. So I thought I would offer you a slide. The blue line is the land surface temperature from Berkeley Earth, which is the gold standard in these matters. The gray are the error bars, so you get to see what the uncertainty lines are. The black dotted line is the trend since 1970. And the blue bars you see are statistically significant departures from the overall trend. So as you can see, yeah, there's been a slight cooling in the temperature record over the past decade. Does that alone suggest to you that climate change was a ginned up problem that we can now walk away from? Not looking at the broader record, I don't think. You can also look at different starting and end points for our analysis using those red bars to find alternative stories about the warming pause that we hear so much about. So there has indeed been a pause in the surface temperature warning data set. It doesn't suggest to me that it's quite the matter that some of my friends on the right would have us believe. The next slide looks at whether the models have indeed failed us. One of the memes we hear oftentimes from my friends on the right is that climate models which predict or which argue that we ought to exercise concern have not proven accurate. Well, this is a slide in which the multicolored lines you see are runs from models from the IPCC fourth assessment. The black line is, again, the Berkeley Earth land surface temperature. And the red line you see is the average climate model run from the fourth IPCC report. It looks fairly accurate to me. Our next slide asks the question, which tells a better story? Those climate models in the IPCC reports which run hot or those which run cold? Again, the multicolored lines are the runs from 43 models in the IPCC report. The black line is the Berkeley Earth land surface temperature data. The blue line are the models with low climate sensitivity that were reported in that report. The red line are the models with the greatest climate sensitivity. It would appear that the models with the greatest sensitivity have a better record at predicting climate than those with lower sensitivity. Next, let's look at the track record of alarmists. We often hear that alarmist scientists have made predictions which have failed to hold up against the test of time. Well, let's consider that. The red line in this particular graph is surface temperature data from NASA. The colored lines represent projections from various different sources. Each of the first four IPCC reports are reported there. Wallace Broker's 1975 paper from Science you can find. That's where the phrase global warming was originally coined. You can see William Kellogg's 79 prediction from the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences. And of course, James Hansen's famous controversial 1988 congressional testimony. You can see that. They look pretty reasonable to me. We've been talking about land data, and so if you're on your game, like I used to be when I was on the other side of this conversation when I was at the Cato Institute, you'd say, well, Mr. Taylor, that's very interesting, this land-based data. What about satellite data? Don't they tell us a different story? Well, this slide comes from the most recent IPCC report. You can see it's an adjusted, a table of adjusted satellite readings for the lower troposphere, mid-troposphere, and lower stratosphere. And what you'll find is exactly what you would expect to find, given what we know about climate science. We've seen cooling in the lower and mid-troposphere. We've seen warming in the lower and mid-troposphere. We've seen cooling in the lower stratosphere, which is exactly what we'd expect to see with conventional understanding of climate change. After all, if we're trapping heat gases in the atmosphere, that means less are radiating out into space, which means the lower stratosphere ought to be cooling. That's exactly what we see. Interesting, however, is that the vertical distribution of warming is still somewhat at issue. It's not entirely clear where the warming will play out, but what we're seeing are signs of warming exactly where we expect to see them. So now we've established that there's a reason to think that mainstream science is indeed mainstream. Let's consider what mainstream scientists think about the future. Alas, there is a lot of uncertainty. First of all, The IPCC most recently reports, as they've been reporting for quite some time, that if we double pre-industrial levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, we will get a warming of somewhere between 2.7 and 8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's been more or less the range of estimates for maybe 40-odd years now, with a break period in which we thought we could lower the line, but we found out we couldn't. That's a pretty big spread, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit versus 8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the likely range of responses if we double CO2 concentrations above pre-industrial levels, and we're almost there. If we continue on business as usual path by the year 2100, according to the IPCC, the likely climate response is somewhere between 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit and 11 degrees Fahrenheit. A very major spread and a very major climate impact. But what does it mean to say likely? According to the IPCC, it means about a 66% chance at best. That means there's a 34% chance the warming will be lower than projected or higher than projected. Now, there's not a whole lot of room on the lower side of that conversation, since we're already almost halfway to the 2.7 degree Fahrenheit mark. So there's a lot more room on the higher side. This is all driven by uncertainty. We don't really know much more than we knew in the 1970s about climate sensitivity, despite everything we have been doing to investigate the problem. But we know that increased CO2 in the atmosphere will indeed increase temperatures. We're just not entirely sure how much. It bears pondering, however, the last time we had CO2 concentrations as high as we have today, which is 400 parts per million, was during the Pliocene epoch over 3 million years ago. During that time, temperatures were 1.8 to 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they are today. Sea levels were 66 feet higher, and camels were in Canada. Now, they're not there yet, but the point is we are engaged in a massive experiment on the planet, the likes of which we have never seen. We do not have data points to have an intelligent conversation about what likely outcomes are, but we know they are absolutely unprecedented. So that's the challenge. We don't know enough to confidently say how much warming we're going to face. We do know enough to say we will face warming. We know what the likely outcome is, but that's not particularly helpful since that's a 66% chance. Marty Weitzman at Harvard concludes that there's about a 10% chance, based on everything the IPCC has reported and what's in the scientific literature, that we will see more than 11 degrees Fahrenheit warming by 2100 if, indeed, we're on a business as usual path. Now, maybe it's not 10%, maybe it's 8%, maybe it's 12%. We don't really know enough to give a concrete number, but we know there is a significant chance of runaway and quite catastrophic climate change. So what do we do about this knowledge? The fact that we're running maybe a 10, or maybe if you're a skeptic, 8 or 7% chance of some sort of catastrophic climate change scenario. Maybe it's higher than 10. Would we continue with business as usual? Would we continue to hold back and wait for better data? Would we continue to wait until some magic technology came along to make addressing this problem painless? I don't think so. We don't act that way in financial markets when ideology is stripped from the conversation about risk aversion. If you knew there was a 10% chance that we would have a major economic downturn along the lines of the Great Depression, would you continue to invest in equities? Heck no. Even though the return on equities is far greater than the return on other investments you might make, you would very well hedge. People do this all the time. What's interesting to me in this conversation, having been involved in on both sides for quite some time, is how the issue of risk aversion changes depending upon what the issue and what your ideology. So, for instance, you might think liberals are extremely risk averse. Conservatives have a more healthy set of, American risk tolerance. But if we switch the issue and ask about, say, weapons of destruction in the Middle East, all of a sudden risk tolerance has changed quite a bit, don't they? Dick Cheney, right after 9/11, for instance, said this: if there is a 1% chance that Pakistani scientists are helping al-Qaeda build or develop a nuclear weapon, we have to treat it as a certainty in terms of our policy response. 1% chance equals certainty, according to Dick Cheney, an intolerable risk. And yet if the risk is 10 times larger of catastrophic climate change, presumably Dick Cheney has a different view about risk aversion and willingness to pay. It makes little sense to me. But the point is we're all captives to some degree about what we want to believe. I believe a healthy position in this debate is to put aside what we want to believe and show the intellectual courage to accept what reality tells us we have to be concerned about and then act on that reality. Now, of course, a lot of my friends say, well, the problem with that, Jerry, is that to act against climate change is to give a big stamp of approval to big government. And these are things that, as a libertarian, I'm not generally happy to do. But we have government in place for a reason. Libertarians and conservatives all agree that government's place in this world, God put it here on this earth to protect life, liberty, and the property of its people. If climate change represents a risk to life, liberty, and property, and it is a risk imposed by actions of identifiable parties, people putting carbon and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it's the government's job to enjoin that damage against the life, liberty, and property of its people. And that is a worthy and legitimate cause for conservatives and libertarians to embrace. I'll leave it at that and now look forward to the question.
So we're over 2. There we go. Actually, my first question for the both of you, one of the frustrations for me as an economist in this space is that I get angry when someone says something's settled. If someone says anything's settled, then I say, okay, so we should stop funding research in that, right? Because it's settled. And so you guys both sort of have different positions about the science of climate change. Neither one of you is a climate scientist, but you're both very well informed. Can I ask you, as a follow-up to this session, to just add footnotes to your presentations that we put up online, so that I can go back and look at the articles myself and start to think about where your different views come from. So I'm asking you to do some work for free, but would you guys both commit to do that? Just,
sure.
Ben, thank you. Ben, it seems like Jerry's argument, that I'm just going to cut right to the one that I find the most interesting as an economist, the Weitzman argument about insurance. Do you think the probability is 0? We talked about Mr. Cheney, Vice President Cheney's 1%. Do you think the probability is 0 of an extreme event, and so that the insurance argument is actually one that we can dismiss? I don't want to make you give it a probability, but it's probably not 0, right?
No, I don't think it's 0, but I mean, Jerry is, if I can paraphrase, I think fairly, but if not, Jerry, speak up.
Put it closer to your mouth, please.
Okay. Jerry is presenting a version of what we all call the fat tail argument, that there's some statistical distribution of future temperature effects of increasing greenhouse gas concentration. There's a danger that the right-hand tail is fat, right? And so we really ought to do something because that's a non-negligible risk. Is that a fair? Okay. The problem with that argument is that there are 2 other fat tails that, and this is not really so much a criticism of Jerry, it's really a criticism of the Council of Economic Advisors and the Obama administration and social cost of carbon analysis. For one thing, there's a left-hand tail as well. A future ice age is virtually a certainty. The only thing we don't know is when it'll occur. And so anthropogenic warming might be a huge benefit. We don't know. It might be. And so it's not to say that alone means we shouldn't do something. It means that analysis of this problem ought to incorporate that effect. There's also the statistical distribution of what I'll just call informally the destructiveness of government policy. And I would argue not only is that tail fat, that whole distribution lies way to the right. And so I really think that the argument, I mean, Jerry's argument, in a sense, and please forgive me, Jerry, we've been friends a long time, and so we can slam each other. Jerry's argument borders on the tautological. If we substitute an efficient carbon tax in place of inefficient regulations, we'll get an efficiency improvement. Yes, that's true, and the sun rises in the east and water flows downhill, et cetera, et cetera. The question is, what sort of predictions can you make about how policy will evolve in a world of political competition? And I think that the answer to that is a good deal less sanguine than Jerry seems to suggest.
Jerry, do you have a mic too? Jerry?
Yeah, I have this.
And yours works?
It's working, isn't it? You guys can hear me? Yeah. Okay, that's what I thought. Well, I didn't suggest that argument from the podium today, but I'll do it in the Q&A if you like. I wanted to make the point that addressing greenhouse gas emissions more aggressively than what we are currently engaged in is a worthy exercise, period. Your question, Kevin, about what we know and are things settled, I think is a very good question. When I was at the Cato Institute on the other side of this debate, I took what I called the Pat Michaels Bjorn Lomborg line, which seems to reflect where most credentialed skeptical scientists tend to be. They do not argue that warming's not happening. They accept that it's happening. They accept that anthropogenic emissions are a major cause of that warming, though they may disagree about whether it's 60, 70, 80%, 20, 30, 40. They'll agree that anthropogenic emissions are a causal factor to the warming we see. And they agree that warming will continue in the future with more CO2 emissions. The disagreement is about how much warming and what's the most likely climate sensitivity we're dealing with. That is where most, though not every, but most skeptical scientists are. And I had accepted that narrative. So if you say, what do we know? I'm fairly confident we can say we know at least that. We know that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are warming the planet, will continue to warm the planet. The open question is how much. Based on what we've seen, based on our understanding of atmospheric physics, it could be a modest amount that we could live with. It could be a catastrophic amount that we cannot. So that's what I argue we know. But given that kind of range of uncertainty, well, how do we best respond? Well, we face risks like this all the time in financial markets. This is why people go to Goldman Sachs and other firms to help them manage these risks. And modern risk assessment does give us some information about how to price and deal with uncertainty. And when we're talking about non-diversifiable risks, which have potentially major economic impacts, we do not and cannot afford to ignore them.
So just to be clear, so we should probably spend a lot more worrying about asteroids that are going to hit the Earth and stuff too, right? That we should need to study these tail.
Yeah, absolutely. For instance, NASA argues that we could put into the atmosphere a program to knock out potential asteroid threats and test something at about $2 billion. I mean, we're not talking about risks that are impossible to imagine addressing. But absolutely, most voters, most people, have relatively short time horizons when it comes to political issues, and they are not particularly interested in spending money now to avert the chance of significant risk or damages later. We see that when it comes to demographic issues associated with the entitlement programs. Heck, we saw it in the 1930s with the rise of Germany and Europe. How many people in Europe are willing to invest now in national defense to forestall the possibility of war with Hitler? Not very many, even when the evidence of the risk was staring them at the face. So this is not something we're very good at doing as voters. I think we, however, have to start getting a little bit better at it.
Jerry, I'm going to come back to you in a sec, Ben, but I now want to come back at you a little bit with, I think, the point that Ben makes that I find the most interesting. And it's that, and we can talk about settled science. Let's talk a little bit about settled social science. That I think that it's probably safe to say that under the null hypothesis, under your null hypothesis, if the U.S. acts and nobody else on Earth does, then the U.S. action will cause us to incur costs that'll turn out not to have been worth it. Because we'll have costs on ourselves, and we wouldn't have had any. Like so, Ben says it's about a few tenths of a degree, and the economic benefit of that is kind of unknowable. Isn't it also the case that the impact that U.S. policy change, like Senator Whitehouse bill, has on the probability that other countries act is unknowable? There's no science that can help us think about that, and so therefore, in some sense, it's a leap of faith for people on your side that, okay, we're going to do this because everybody else is going to act, but I don't think there's any empirical support for that proposition. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. I think that Ben raises an important point, which is correct but needs to be qualified. So when Ben offered his numbers about how little emissions, how little temperature change we get, even if all the industrialized nations of the world embrace a tax along these lines, that's correct. The number is correct. But it also ignores the fact by 2100, according to the IEA, the non-industrialized nations that Ben is leaving out of that calculation will be responsible for 5 times the emission of today's industrialized nations. So it doesn't tell you what global action would produce. It tells you what partial action would produce. And Ben's absolutely right. It takes a global response. Now, we can't know for certain at all how the world is going to react to a U.S. carbon tax, but we know a couple of things. First, we know that U.S. action is a necessary but insufficient condition for global action. So that much we do know. And we also know that if you've got border adjustment policies in place, countries will, at least countries who are exporting to the United States in a significant way, are going to face a choice.
Just one thing, I just want to correct that in the sense of just logically, that the U.S. Movement is necessary, but U.S. movement first, logically, is not necessary.
Correct.
I just wanted to clarify
Yes.
that. And you're arguing for U.S. movement first, and that's not a necessary condition.
I am certainly open. There's arguments by Marty Weitzman that suggest that it may be better for the U.S. not to act first, but to act jointly, but try to as aggressively produce something along the lines of the carbon tax bill we're discussing today as a global matter. And that it might be better for the U.S. to withhold initial action. I'm open to that conversation. I'm not persuaded, but it could very well be correct. But U.S. action, in some extent, is a necessary
And I'm
correct.
about to give the mic to Ben, but I just want to make a final point, that you're not even buying insurance then, really. Because if you don't know the other guys are going to act, then there's the value of the insurance. So an insurance that's not going to pay off is not really insurance. It's something else. It's just a cost. So anyway, here's Ben.
The other guys will act given a
Hold it
sufficient.
closer to your mouth.
The other guys will act given a sufficiently large side payment. How big is it? I don't know. But I mean, let's think about the rest of the world that Jerry is alluding to, what is now the less developed world, right? Why are they less developed, Jerry? They're less developed because they have lousy institutions. For whatever set of complex reasons we understand poorly. They don't defend property rights very well. They don't have capitalism as you and I would define it. All right? Your argument basically is that by raising their energy costs, I think I'm putting words in your mouth, but not all that egregiously. By raising their energy costs and putting them on welfare, we will get an efficiency improvement globally. I mean, I just cannot believe something like that. And it may be true in a partial equilibrium sense in which you get reductions in greenhouse gas concentrations, even under the assumption that they're in some sense important, for which I see no evidence at all. But in a general equilibrium sense, putting them on welfare and raising their costs cannot result, I don't think, in an improvement in institutions in the less developed world, which is really what we ought to be striving for.
Well, I will go on record as opposing putting them on welfare. Well, that's not what I'm proposing. I'm proposing pricing carbon in the United States with the eye towards pricing carbon internationally. And if we do that and say we have a carbon price in China or India or whatnot, then the Chinese government will be collecting carbon revenue and then using it for state expenditures or for tax cuts elsewhere, for whatever they're going to use the money for. Governments need money. I'm not sure how that equates to welfare, Ben. And as far as the efficiency argument, if it is certainly the case, for instance, to go back to our analogy, the difference between investing in equity and investing in bonds, that you get a greater return from investing in equity and you lose wealth when you divert resources from investing in equity to investing in bonds, that's correct. Except what you're missing here is that bonds give you some assurity that if bad times come, you will get a payoff of some sort. And that's largely what a carbon tax does. It is a hedge against the possibility of significant disruption down the road. And you, again, 10%, 8%, 14%, and that's the chance of 11 degrees Fahrenheit or worse warming under business as usual. Even if we don't hit that fat tail and we're within the range of 8 degrees, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, it's pretty hard to imagine the costs involved in that. It would be staggering. And so it seems to me that we're not in a business of trying to maximize efficiency for next year or the year thereafter. We're in the business of trying to intelligently allocate assets given all of this economic uncertainty associated with climate change.
Yeah, I'm a bit at a disadvantage. The chart you showed purporting to illustrate the consistency between the model projections and the actual temperature record is the first time I've ever seen something like that.
But that's why we're going to put up the slides and document them so we can
Hang out with me.
Yeah, right. Well, okay. Speaking of welfare, Jerry, what is that $100 billion nominal fund that the Chinese are complaining only has $10 billion in it now?
Okay, so I have one last question for Ben, and then I'm going to. Let's Jerry, you want to answer that?
I didn't quite understand.
Rhetorical.
Would you ask?
I intuited a rhetorical question.
Well, it's both rhetorical and real. If you don't think that the drive internationally, now COP21 in Paris, is to put the less developed nations on welfare in exchange for them raising their energy costs, What's that $100 billion transfer fund supposed to be?
I am not embracing the negotiated positions of what's coming up out of there.
Okay, so Ben, I have a last question for you,
Sure.
and then we'll go to Q&A. And again, I promised folks that we could run late potentially because if questions run late. So suppose that we accept that we're economists and that we're going to use models to think about things. And then, maybe now we don't have enough economic models. But in the end, that we decide that there are enough models that say the result that we see from the RFF report, that if you have a carbon tax and cut the corporate tax rate, that you can at least sort of leave the economy unharmed by the carbon tax. That there's some probability mass on the positive side, but let's just say that you leave it unharmed. And my main work has not been on the carbon tax, but on the corporate tax, and I believe that cutting it is a good thing. And so let's just say that you could leave it unharmed. Then isn't what Senator Whitehouse, assuming that it was designed correctly, proposing, if we accept all the things that we've discussed, is that we get insurance that has really low value at really low cost? Isn't that like a logical conclusion?
No, I think it is not for two reasons.
Okay.
One, the no harm premise I think is wrong. You have to get an allocational shift across sectors because there's going to be a relative price shift in the economy. That's harm, depending on how you view this externality. The larger point is I cannot envision a public choice model or a political equilibrium in which we raise energy costs for everyone in order to give the corporate sector a tax cut. I just cannot see that. And so really what you're going to wind up doing is spending 100+% of the tax revenues to subsidize various groups. The net effect of that has to be an increase in the size of the government and a decrease in the size of the private sector. And I don't see how you can square that with the pursuit of efficiency.
The way one could square it is to say that the corporate tax is borne mostly by labor, AEI studies that show that. So that kind of squares this. And we're starting from a distorted equilibrium where there's a high tax on capital, which is very suboptimal. I don't know why we're getting feedback.
It's my fault.
Okay, so anyway, with that, let's now go to questions and answers. Let's try to make our statements in the form of a question, and please wait for the mic and state your identity before we go. And I guess what I'll do is maybe just give people numbers. Can you try to remember them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And I'm sorry I went from right to left, but I promise 9. We're going to go to you before we ask anyone else for their question. Okay.
So just to go back to this last point, my name's Bill Ecow. I'm with the Partnership for Responsible Growth. And if I understand you, Mr. Zycher, what you're effectively saying is you don't believe that what the senator has proposed in the form of a swap is actually politically achievable, and therefore you're against it. Because in theoretically, if the idea is a swap, for example, Dale Jorgensen, Professor Jorgensen at Harvard has written this book, Double Dividend. Every dollar we take in carbon fees and apply to reducing taxes on capital and investment and business gives you actually an increase in economic growth, which is good for everybody. So it's actually a net positive to the extent that you do that with the money. What you're saying is you don't believe that you could actually politically do that with the money, and therefore you're opposed to the idea? That doesn't make sense.
Well, first of all, that's not the Whitehouse Schatz proposal. Their proposal is to use some of the revenues to cut corporate taxes and the rest of the revenues to fund transfers. Well, just let me answer your question, okay? That's not their proposal. Second, I don't believe that can possibly be a political equilibrium. And third, this is not really a seminar on optimal taxation, and Kevin and I have gone back and forth on this endlessly, but there's a real issue about what you mean by optimal taxation. The assumption that capital taxation somehow is growth reducing depends on an assumption that there is no demand for national defense services created by capital investment. If you believe that there's an external threat, either by nations or by terrorist groups, that grows with the capital stock, you may not believe that, fine. But if you do believe that, then in some model, in a national defense model of efficient taxation, it's actually efficient to tax capital, including human capital, because it reduces the foreign threat. We're not here to get into that issue, but the narrow answer to your question is, A, that's not what the two senators are proposing, and B, no, if it were what they're proposing, I don't believe that's a political equilibrium.
Okay, number 2. Where are we? Thank you, and the mic's right there.
Okay, yeah, my name is Michael Goff. My question concerns the issue of other countries, whether or not they'll follow the United States if the United States goes with this proposal. One of the consequences I would expect to see from a economy-wide carbon tax is much more private sector investment in low-carbon energy technologies, efficient energy technologies, and so forth, and resulting diffusion of these technologies around the world. Does that become a sort of indirect mechanism by which other countries would follow the United States on this? And if so, can it be quantified in any reasonable way?
To whom are you directing your question?
Well, whoever wants to answer it. You can both answer it if you want. Yeah.
Well, I don't know what you mean by efficient energy. I mean, energy technologies, just to pick 2 examples, wind and solar power, are efficient or can be made efficient if fossil fuel costs are driven artificially high. Artificially is a loaded term. Jerry would argue it's not artificial. Jerry would argue that because of this externality, they're artificially low, and fine, we can debate that. Do I think the world can run on wind and solar power? I think that's impossible. And I think what's not been noticed, by the way, is that an increasing market share of wind and solar power has the effect of actually increasing, not reducing, both greenhouse gas emissions and the emissions of ordinary pollutants, basically because the unreliability of renewables means that they have to be backed up with conventional plants, which have to be cycled up and down and therefore run rather inefficiently. So I really don't think that the premise that a carbon tax will lead to some sort of fundamental change in the energy mix, both in the U.S. and worldwide. On the margin, it would certainly have an effect, but I think fundamentally it would not. Wouldn't you?
Well, to the question of what other nations, how they would, or how other nations would respond to our carbon tax, again, we don't know. We do know for certain that any effective action requires a global response. We know that it is very unlikely that we'll see a global response if the United States insists on free riding off other greenhouse gas emissions or if they refuse to act. So that much we do know. So America's present policy of very anemic action is an obstacle to the global response that we all agree we need to see if we are to address this problem. But I want to also introduce a moral and ethical position. A guy named Ed Dolan wrote a piece in Cato Journal back in 2006, back when I was at Cato. I thought he made a very good point. He said, if you're part of a mob which is looting a store during a riot, should you stop? If you stop, does that mean the looting would stop? No. If you stop, does that mean the guys whose store you are looting is going to keep all of his property? No. If you stop looting, will you be less wealthy than you might otherwise have been if you continued to loot? Yes. If you stop looting, will other people stop looting? Probably not. So is this an argument to continue to loot? His argument is no. Under any moral and ethical calculus that we would defend in any other context, if we accept this mainstream scientific narrative about climate change, then we are faced with exactly that sort of moral dilemma. And to me, even if our actions cannot be guaranteed to produce the global reaction we want, we have a moral and ethical imperative to act.
Here's another moral
so
principle, Jerry.
Ben, you go.
How about not using the coercive power of the state to transfer wealth among interest groups? That's a form of looting too. Why is that more desirable than straightforward looting?
I am against it as well.
Okay, number 3. Thank you, and thank you all for remembering your numbers. I've forgotten them already.
Hi, Jacob Wucher. So, considering the huge amount of money flowing into the political process from big science, can you talk a bit about the liberals' perverse incentive in this, whole debate?
Well, I'm not here to attack liberals or conservatives. I would make the point that the federal government spends, what is it, $20 billion a year, broadly defined, on climate research and climate policy and all the rest. And I think Jerry would agree the bureaucracy is not a disinterested interest group. It has its own goals, it has its own biases, it has its own interests, et cetera. And so I think that the implicit argument that Senator Whitehouse, I think, said almost explicitly that it's only the private sector that has incentives to distort is fundamentally wrong.
You know, there's a lot I might say about that topic, but we do have a lot of other questions, so I will just restrain myself to this answer. I think that getting involved in a discussion about what motives different parties have in this conversation is to go into a La Brea tar pit of logical fallacy, which I would rather not go.
Okay, number 4 is right here, I think. Here, borrow my mic.
Oh, okay. I'm Alan Carlin, and it seems to me that we're missing the main point. CO2 emissions will mainly go up in China and India, not the U.S. They are, in my opinion, rightly opposed to increasing their cost of energy, and their growth will be hurt if they should raise energy prices. Why would we want to lower their growth? I don't think we do. Why should they agree to this? I don't think they will. And a U.S. CO2 tax will more or less hurt us and have no effect.
I guess that's kind of a question for Jerry.
I didn't know if there was a question.
I think, well, let me ask it. So suppose you got 300 million citizens living on $1 or $2 a day, then you care probably a lot more about growth than anything else.
Oh, absolutely true.
And so doesn't that undermine or reduce the probability significantly of the sort of collective action that makes something globally actually
Oh, absolutely.
occur?
The wealthier society is, the more willing it will be to invest in the procurement of environmental goods and services. That much we know. If we assume the globe will continue to get wealthier, you're going to see an increase in demand for environmental goods and services. But it's absolutely correct that the poorer you are, the less likely you are to demand these things. I am not sitting here telling you that it's a certainty that global action will occur to impose a carbon price or anything of the kind. All I'm here to say is that we must try. Given what we know about the risk posed by climate change, we must try. We may fail, but I do know that if the United States permanently puts aside any aggressive action on climate change, we will never have any chance of securing that kind of a global agreement.
Ben, do you want to say anything before it, or we just go to Mr.
Let's
5?
just go on. Let's
Okay,
just go on.
we're up to 5, I think. I can't pick a new person, so whoever 5 was.
I was fine.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Okay. Okay, well, you could be 6 then. And if,
David Moore, like,
okay, I might have pointed to
Okay.
2 people or something.
Anyway,
In this
I'm-
case, we can have 2 5s.
5.5.
5.5.
Okay, I'm still David Kreutzer from the Heritage Foundation. And my question, mostly to Jerry, but I'd be interested to hear other responses. You seem to have proposed an ineffective solution to an unlikely problem. And I think Kevin pointed out that what you're saying, the carbon tax is not insurance, but it's also not some sort of portfolio balancing. If I put 10% of my portfolio in bonds and the equities crash, I have that 10%. If I do 10% of a solution to climate change with some sort of partial tax that we know won't cut CO2 enough, what do I get? I don't get anything. So a 10% solution to climate change is nothing. We don't want to have a 100% solution for something that I'm not Cheney, for something that has a 10% likelihood. So it seems like we need something completely different if we believe there is something serious coming, but a carbon tax isn't it.
If I buy fire insurance and I don't get a fire, I wasted my money. So that's certainly true. But I don't think we get nothing.
Buying fire insurance is going to lower the temperature of the fire 2 degrees.
If there were for instance, if there were a global agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by, say, 50% by the middle of the century, that would imply a carbon tax of around $35 a ton in 2020, increasing by about 4% a year. That would give you the emissions reductions we seek. That would put you on a trajectory to keep you below a 2C warming by 2100, and thus avoid some of the bigger risks. So it is possible that a carbon tax along the lines discussed by Senator Whitehouse, were it globalized, could indeed accomplish something. But if it does not, I don't believe you find nothing of gain. According to Resources for the Future and other studies I've seen from the IMF, the co-benefits associated with addressing carbon emissions are give you about the same degree of benefits as you pay in the tax. Now, I know Ben would have you believe the particulate matter either doesn't matter or there would be no marginal reduction in PM emissions as a course of a carbon tax, but I don't think you really mean to say that, Ben.
I didn't say that. I said that under the Clean Air Act, EPA is supposed to promulgate regulations that protect the public health with an adequate margin of safety. They are now quadruple counting the same particulate reductions that justify 4 rules. Either they're admitting that the existing rules don't satisfy the requirements of the law, or they're quadruple counting, or they're admitting that they're going to be reducing particulate emissions to an inefficiently low level. One of those 3 has to be true.
Okay, 5.5. I hope I haven't completely messed up my numbering system.
Hi, I'm 5B, Ken Hoppola with the Science Environmental Policy Project. My question is directed more towards Jerry. And one, thank you for bringing up something that few people mention, that for 35 years, we've been laboring under the assumption that a doubling of CO2 will result in a temperature increase of about 1.5 to 3.5 degrees C. Used Fahrenheit, which is about the same. My question to you is this. The United States government, based on government reports, have spent over $40 billion since 1993 on what they call climate science and has failed to narrow this wide range of error. What would you suggest we can do to have that range of error reduced?
I don't know. It is an interesting point. The estimate is exactly as you say. Since the 1970s, the range for expected temperature increase from a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere has been between 1.5 and 4 degrees C. Yeah, true. 4.5, excuse me. So that's absolutely correct. We have not been able to narrow the range. That's largely because we do not understand atmospheric physics and long-term climate as much as we would like. That is something that when I was in Ben's shoes arguing his position, I would often put on the table and say, we don't know enough to intelligently guide policy. Look at all the uncertainties we have. Look at the lack of knowledge. And before we spend a lot of social resources, we need to quantify this a little bit better and get a better understanding. So that uncertainty is used as an argument against action, but it's also an argument for action. Because we know that with that uncertainty, it can cut both ways. And we also know that the implications of being wrong on this front, or the implications of just likely trajectories, is devastating on a business as usual path today.
In fact, the range has narrowed. IPIC in the 5th assessment report, the midpoint of its range is now 3 degrees for a doubling of CO2 concentrations. It used to be 4.5. If you look at the peer-reviewed literature over the last 5 years, that peer-reviewed literature, something like 20 papers, suggests that even the 3-degree mid-range IPIC estimate is about 40% too high. Now, maybe the literature is right, maybe it's wrong, but in fact, the estimated range has narrowed, and Jerry is right in the sense that the science is not settled, notwithstanding what Senator Whitehouse would have us believe.
Okay, so we've got 6, 7, 8, and 9. We're going to 6 now. I would ask the respondents to try to be kind of quick about it because we are right now at our end point, but I'm not going to impose a hard end, as I said. And it's not rude to leave early if you thought you had to leave at 4:15, but I know a lot of people want to continue the conversation. So please.
Alex Bosmosky, republican.org. And I'm wondering if we accept Mr. Zycher's assertion that side payments or bribes are the viable mechanism by which to bring developing countries into the fold on carbon pricing, then are we to assume that South Africa, South Korea, Kazakhstan, Mexico, Costa Rica, other developing countries that have self-imposed or implementing carbon pricing regimes domestically are currently the recipients of bribes or payouts? And by whom might we expect those payouts are coming from?
I don't know of any explicit quid pro quo. Yes, they're implementing climate policies for all kinds of political reasons that I understand only imperfectly. But in terms of getting the Chinese on board, the Indians, et cetera, anyone who believes they're going to go along with this at COP21 without some sort of a massive side payment, I think is engaged in a serious exercise in self-delusion.
Although the one thing one could say, right, is that, again, go to the asteroid example. If there's an asteroid coming to destroy the Earth and everybody on Earth knows it, then I don't think we'd have trouble getting people to pool their resources to try to stop it. And so I could imagine a scientific discovery, but like at some point the consensus could move to the point where everybody would say, okay, so the asteroid's really coming, and so we're going to act. And so I don't think it's unthinkable that you could disagree. So 7?
Hi, I'm Will Candler, and I wonder, there's a question getting the House of Representatives on board and whether you've in any way talked with Chris Van Hollen and about his bill of cap and dividend. Thank you.
I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
I have no knowledge of.
We are at the Niskanen Center engaged in trying to build congressional support for a revenue-neutral carbon tax that swaps out the existing regulatory infrastructure at the EPA. We've talked to a number of different congressional offices, and we found that there is that they look at this argument of ours as something of a novelty, which they haven't thought much about. But there is interest, and we'll see what's going to happen.
So just to be clear for myself, I've never asked you this question. So are you a C4 advocacy organization or a C3?
We are C3.
Okay.
We are educating them.
So you're
well.
educating them. Okay. I think we're up to 8, am I remembering right? Okay. So could I have the next question? I guess we're all the way up. Oh no, we have an 8 and then 8 is here and then 9, and I guess we will stop it there.
Thank you. Marlo Lewis with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Question is mostly for Jerry. Jerry, you made the case that conservatives are being inconsistent with the usual way that they address issues of potential catastrophic risk. Conservatives and libertarians agree that sometimes it's prudent to intervene and that this is government's proper role. And what I think you are overlooking here is that there is not only a risk of disaster from climate change, but a risk of disaster from climate policy. This, I think, is one of the basic libertarian insights of free market environmentalists, people like Fred Smith, that risks have to be weighed against other risks. Now, you have talked about 2 degrees as the objective of mainstream science. Senator Whitehouse did as well, and you both have talked about reducing in the mainstream, that means a reduction in industrial country emissions of 80%, which is what his carbon tax aims to do. Now, Stephen Yulee at the Chamber of Commerce has done a wonderful analysis and shows that if all the industrialized countries in the world were to follow us and reduce their emissions 80% below 2010 levels by 2050, which is the EU proposal in the climate conference, which is allegedly based on mainstream science, as far as I can tell it is. It means that developing countries, in order to meet that target and get below that danger level of the danger threshold of 2 degrees, must reduce their emissions almost 50%, not below their baseline in 2050, but below their current emissions. Now, you know that this is an area of the world where billions of people lack access to any kind of modern energy. Don't you see the obvious potential for a humanitarian disaster in trying for the United States in trying to lead the whole world to cut carbon emissions by 60% below 2010 levels by 2050? How do these poor countries ramp up their economies, fuel the growth of their economies, and then suddenly drop down their emissions to 50% below where they are today without trapping billions of people in hunger and poverty? That is a horrendous risk that I don't think anybody on your side of this debate talks about, and I wish you would. So if you have any thoughts on it, please give us those.
Well,
Jerry?
I'm 7 minutes past my closing point, so I can't share with you all the thoughts I have about that.
That's correct.
But a quick couple. It will cost money to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If you swap out the carbon tax for other tax cuts in the U.S., Kevin will tell you that you can get costs to rather close to a wash. That's not always going to be the case in other countries. So I would not be in the slightest bit surprised that even the most efficiently executed carbon tax will still impose costs. How much cost would it impose is somewhat unclear because we don't know baseline trajectories for economic growth, technological change, and price impacts from switching to, say, nuclear power right now, totally uneconomic, might be economic tomorrow. We don't know. We can only make broad guesses. But one thing we do know, that likely scenario that the mainstream scientific community tells us gives us climate change which is near catastrophic. And with a 10% chance of even shooting past that, if Weitzman's correct, or 8 or 7 or 12 or 15, we're talking about global economic impacts in GDP on the order of 10 to 30%. That is truly catastrophic for everybody on this planet, and we can't ignore that based on a conversation in isolation. But that's where I'll end it for.
Okay, so Ben, do you want to add anything, or should we go
Well,
to the last question?
I mentioned earlier that the second fat tail, or the third rather, to be considered is the fat tail on the destructiveness of government policy, and that's consistent with Marlowe's point. And if there was some evidence, Jerry, that increasing greenhouse gas concentrations are actually having a measurable effect in terms of climate phenomena, I would have more confidence in your argument, but I see no such evidence.
And on to the last question.
My name is David Payton. The question for Mr. Zycher: does any real-world situation exist that calls for a large-scale public policy response in the United States? And if so, what should that response consist of?
I don't quite understand. I mean, to a limited government libertarian, government should enforce contracts, provide for the national defense, prevent people from harming each other, et cetera, et cetera. I don't quite understand your question.
Unless it's with
Is there a policy issue that demands a big response? I don't quite understand the question. If you could rephrase it, perhaps.
Rising world temperatures, rising carbon concentration.
Temperatures have been rising in fits and starts.
Situations call for a large-scale public policy
Temperatures have been
response?
rising in fits and starts since the end of the Little Ice Age in around 1850. Temperatures rose until about 1883 with the eruption of Krakatoa, then fell until about 1900. Temperatures rose from 1910 to 1940, were roughly flat through 1950 or 1960, depending on which data set you look at, then increased from roughly 1950 or 60 through the mid to late 1970s, or decreased
Pretty
rather.
remarkable memory. I was looking at the chart while you were talking.
Increased from the late 70s through 1998, which was a strong El Nino year, so that mucks up the data a little bit, and have depending on the data set, have increased slightly since then. So the question then becomes, what part of that is anthropogenic in origin? Jerry is absolutely right. The answer is not zero. It is also true that we don't know the answer to that question. Anybody who claims we do is talking out of his or her hat. We don't know the answer to that question, and we need more work that's serious in order to answer it.
Well, I guess we need more work that's serious is a great place to end this. But thanks so much. I think that we all do this because we love to argue with people we disagree with, and the benefit of this approach, I think, was proven today by you guys. Thanks so much, Jerry, for coming, and thanks, Ben, for organizing this event.